Hello, this is Dr. Versalati. In this screencast, I'm going to talk about some of the important issues in the introduction chapter of Endley's A Linguistic Perspective on English Grammar. In addition to this screencast, you can also find a static version of this infographic in the course. First, let me share my objectives of the screencast with you. The main goal is to review the principles about taking a linguistic perspective on English grammar. And by doing so, I want you to perhaps inspire thinking about how these principles might influence your own classroom teaching practice. And I want to model the use of an infographic. Okay, let's move on to the important ideas. The first principle is that a linguistic perspective involves treating language as a natural phenomenon, describing its regularities and patterns in a manner that increases our overall understanding. This is a very important principle for understanding this course in a linguistic perspective. So in linguistics, we want to understand the patterns and the exceptions to those patterns, so that we can better understand English grammar or any language, but in this course it will be focused on English. And understanding that language follows patterns, not strict rules, is very, very important because grammar books often list grammar rules and treats them as if they're like math, like 3 + 1 always equals 4. But in language, what we consider as grammatical, or better yet, what we say or write, really depends. For instance, normally we could say that generally we do not use progressive aspect, the be plus the ing added to the verb, the progressive aspect with stative verbs. We don't say things like, I'm having a car, or I'm loving you, husband. But it's not a strict rule because, as we know, McDonald's came out with a whole advertising campaign with the tag, I'm loving it. And that might feel that this is breaking the rule, but if we think a little more deeply about it, we can see that there's a pattern here. Because I could say, as I'm watching a television show, I'm loving this episode. And as native speakers, we would accept that, and we would, if we found enough examples of that being used in a natural way, we could find that pattern, that what this actually does when we use the progressive aspect with a stative verb, it limits the length of that state. I'm loving this episode. Love is normally a long-term state, but if we put the progressive aspect, it means that right now, at this time, in this short period of time, I'm loving it. So what I did just then is follows up with the principle, the second principle, about focusing on describing language. We want to describe, not prescribe, or we don't want to tell people what to do, but describe what we actually do. And I know as language teachers, we might this might feel in conflict. Taking these two linguistic perspectives of following patterns and describing, not prescribing, might feel in conflict with our role as a teacher. But as I just did with the example of the stative verbs, if we focus on the pattern and describe what users of the language do with those patterns, that might be a more important tool than saying you can't put progressive aspect with stative verbs, because then you get lots of questions like, a native speaker did this, or this commercial did this. So it actually oversimplifies the language when we say that there are strict rules and we tell people what to say. Okay, I'm going to go a little out of order because I think Principle 4 connects really well with 1 and 2. And Principle 4 states that from a linguistic perspective, a sentence is grammatical if it might be plausibly uttered by a native speaker or a competent non-native speaker of a standard variety of the language under normal circumstances. So if you would say it as a competent speaker of English, it's grammatical. And this is a useful principle to think about as we're describing patterns rather than following strict rules, because sometimes we say, well then what is grammatical? A linguistic perspective does not mean that anything's grammatical. We know that you can't say red the car, mine is, right? There's still grammar and things that are following those patterns. The other question we have to kind of tackle is when we say standard variety, what is standard English, or better yet, whose English is standard? So this is also something that we have to consider. We know that the patterns of American English differs from the patterns of British English, not just in how we pronounce things, but also in sentence structure. So that's just something we have to keep in mind. Principle 3 states that a linguistic perspective requires attention to function as well as form. So let's first make sure we understand what form is. So form means the actual shape of the word or the structure. So if we take a word, it would be how we pronounce it, or how we spell it. And sometimes we simplify language into thinking that we can just know the word and know its definition. But it's more complex than that, even with just using words instead of entire linguistic constructions or sentences or paragraphs. Even if we just focus on a word, the right word to use in any particular sentence depends on what we want to be doing with that, like what the function of that sentence is. So we're going to not just think about the form and the meaning, but how and when we use it. And this goes back to that idea of patterns. For instance, if we take a rule-based approach, we might say, well, don't use passive voice. But actually, there's lots of reasons when we do want to use passive voice. For when, like we might want to say something like the book was stolen from the library, if we don't know who the person was who stole it. We also might use a passive construction if we don't want to highlight the agent of who did something that is maybe that would be more hurtful, to highlight the doer, the agent of that, by putting the agent in subject position. So again, by describing the patterns and how we use it, it will be more useful than thinking of rules. And when we take this position of thinking about the form and the function and how we teach English by thinking about patterns, we might have to consider if the way that we've always taught it, using traditional labels, are useful. So Principle 5 is a linguistic perspective involves reconsidering traditional definitions and explanations. For instance, do we want to use terms such as past participle? Is that useful? So moving on to Principle 6, linguistic perspective involves a consideration of spoken forms as well as written forms. So the grammar that we expect in speech is very different than the grammar that we expect in writing. And again, if we take a perspective of following the patterns and thinking about the form, rather than saying this is right or wrong, we can see lots of examples of this, right? We can pick up a novel and we'll see lots of sentences that are not incomplete, that start with a capital letter, end in a period, but they really aren't a complete sentence. And if we ever record our daily conversations, try it if you'd like, we will find out that we don't speak in complete sentences. So let's keep that in mind, that maybe what we expect in written as we teach English grammar is going to be different than what we might expect in spoken language. And principle 7 is the idea that a linguistic perspective requires us to recognize that grammars are dynamic, not static, and they change over time. And when we say grammars change, we mean language changes. What is grammatical and how we use the language changes over time. It's not a road that's straight and always goes the same exact way and that we can always count on it. But over time, what is grammatical might become ungrammatical, and what is ungrammatical might be considered grammatical. So again, this is why a linguistic perspective of talking about patterns rather than strict rules may be useful. And I have a metaphor here of the Mississippi River, and we know how that water flow has changed direction, and it has made places where it diverges and it makes these oxbow lakes. And I think that's a really good metaphor for how language is, because sometimes the patterns that we currently use, there are some things that fall outside of those patterns because that's perhaps what the language used to do. So moving down to the relevant terms, if you see an asterisk, that means that it's marked in some way because it's considered ungrammatical or strange to native speakers. For instance, despite it rained, we still enjoyed our vacation. Endley talks about procedural knowledge, and that's knowing how to use the language appropriately. He uses the metaphor of riding a bicycle. We might know how to ride a bicycle, but not understand the physics of how we balance. And as competent speakers of English, we have a lot of procedural knowledge, but not always declarative knowledge, which is the conscious knowledge about the language. So that's what we're going to work on in this class. We will gain a lot of declarative knowledge. Endley uses these two abbreviations, EUE, Expert User of English, and DUE, Developing User of English, so as to not differentiate people who are highly competent second language users of English. And here are the questions that I want you to consider. Which of those linguistic principles resonates with you? Which one just you thought, oh yeah, that's right? And how might that principle influence your teaching? And which of those principles might be really, really challenging to you? And how might that tension really influence your teaching?